Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is continuing our series, our exploration of friendship in the Bible. And now that we've sort of studied the narratives of friendship in the stories of David and Jonathan and Ruth and Naomi, we're going to take it in a bit of a different direction. We are going to consider the two figures in the Old Testament who are identified as friends of God, namely Abraham and Moses. So we're going to consider Abraham and Moses as friends of God in this video lecture and in the accompanying reading assignment. Let me say something briefly about that reading assignment. We will be exploring Genesis 12 through 20. Which I would refer to as the Abraham cycle. This is the story of Abraham, the sort of patriarch and forefather of the people of Israel. It starts with him as an inhabitant of Ur, being called by God to go to a land that he has not yet seen or even heard about. And in that sort of pathway, he goes through Egypt, and there's all sorts of adventure. So we'll be reading that story, that life cycle, if you will, of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and their two children, Ishmael and Isaac, and all that it might tell us, that narrative about Abraham. And then I've asked you also to read Exodus 33, where Moses is identified as a friend of God. And so I want to say something briefly about both of these identifications, Abraham as a friend of God and Moses as a friend of God. First, Abraham as a friend of God. This is not named in the text of Genesis. It doesn't say in Genesis that Abraham is a friend of God, but we see this identification in other biblical literature, including Isaiah and James, that Abraham is identified as almost the model of friendship with God. And I think that that's an interesting point for us to consider. And so what I would suggest for this reading assignment from Genesis 12 through 20 is I would invite you to put on as your goggles for reading, as your lens for reading, something that we've covered in the sermon series here at First Press, if you've been listening, and something that is well known from antiquity, and that is the three forms of friendship according to Aristotle. Aristotle is that very famous, very important Greek philosopher who wrote about a lot from ethics and poetry to rhetoric and about government and politics. But in his discussion of friendship, he identifies three basic types of friendships, and these sort of are progressive. The third is the ideal, the best form of friendship. And so the first form of friendship is friends based on utility. These are friends who have a great lake house that you want to visit. They have multiple connections that maybe you're trying to network with. You don't necessarily like them in and of themselves, but you like what they can provide for you. So you're always trying to get something out of this. That's the first one, a friendship based on utility. The second form of friendship is friendship based on pleasure. It's a friendship based on enjoyment or fun. People that meet you at the bar or go to the sports game with you or even maybe bike ride. There again, the friendship is not based on the person in and of themselves. It's based on the experience that goes along with them. And Aristotle would say both friendships based on utility and friendships based on pleasure are problematic, or at least non-ideal, because once the utility or once the pleasure moves away, there's no basis for the friendship. So to put it in our modern terms, as soon as the lake house is sold, you don't have to be friends with that person anymore. As soon as you're married with kids and can't go to the bar every night, that friendship fizzles, right? And so Aristotle would say friendships based on utility and friendships based on pleasure have the weakest basis for genuine friendship. And so he says the third is friendship that is based on the character or the goodness of the person or the friendship itself. It's not seeking to get anything out from the friendship. It's not seeking even to just simply enjoy or have this pleasant experience. It looks to a friend and says, there's something about your character, there's something about who you are that makes me want to be friends with you and to do friendship with you. And so when we come to Genesis 12 through 20, what I encourage you to do is think about Abraham's life and Abraham's relationship with God and the ways in which his reliance, his relationship with God sort of moves through these three forms of friendship. When does he see God and that relationship with God primarily as providing a benefit, providing a good? And that's the basis of the relationship. When does his relationship with God sort of have pleasure, or we might say safety, as its primary motivator? And then third, when does his relationship move into what Aristotle would call a genuine friendship with God? When it's based on the good character of God alone. I think that this offers us, again, while Genesis doesn't say that Abraham was a friend of God, it offers us an interesting point of departure, interesting point of entry into the story of Abraham. And so again, read Abraham. How does Abraham move from a utilitarian basis of friendship to one based on pleasure or safety to one that is finally based on the goodness and character of God in and of itself? Now, Exodus 33, just one chapter, is where Moses is explicitly identified as a friend of God. And maybe you'll rely on some of what you remember about Moses, some of what you know about Moses. But the key question here is, what is it that merits this identification? What is it about Moses's and God's interactions that would suggest that Moses is a friend of God? What does that look like? What might that tell us about friendship with God, as well as maybe friendship with one another? For this week, I'm going to bypass our traditional three questions and instead focus on this idea of friendship with God, because that's really what we're dealing with in these selections, is friendship with God. We might say that there's room for considering other relationships, other friendships among humans in these stories, but we're going to focus on friendship with God. And so my first question is, what do Abraham and Moses teach us about friendship with God? What do they teach us about friendship as a model for the spiritual life, about friendship as a model for our understanding of how humans can and should maybe relate to God? A second is drawing on our previous discussion of Ruth and the virtue of chesed, of loyalty and faithfulness. Where do you see chesed, loyalty, faithfulness, being experienced between human characters and God? One final note, you may have noticed in the reading guide for this class on friendship in the Bible that I've suggested a bonus reading from Philo on his treatise on Abraham. And I want to just say a couple of words about Philo and why this might be a fun bonus extra reading for you. Philo is a 1st century Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Virginia, Egypt, not Virginia, but was a Greek-speaking Jew who we get from some of his other writings had a sense of prominence among the Jewish community in Alexandria. We know that in addition to being a Jewish philosopher, he was also an interpreter of the Jewish Bible, of the Old Testament, especially the Torah. And Philo, as a reader of Scripture, was deeply committed to the allegorical tradition or the allegorical way of reading Scripture. There's a Stoic background to this reading of Scripture. It's what Stoic philosophers and other philosophers did with ancient Greek writings like Homer. It's essentially a way of finding a deeper and more morally acceptable meaning of these ancient or sacred texts. So you can think that if the philosophers, ancient philosophers, read Homer and they saw gods doing pretty immoral stuff, pretty shocking stuff, they are trying to preserve their morality, their understanding of what is good and what is right, in their allegorical interpretation. So they'll take the instances of gods doing crazy or immoral things, and they'll find a deeper meaning that enables those ancient texts to continue to be relevant and important and normative for subsequent readers. And in large part, that's what Philo's doing with the Torah, with the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is he's trying to find a deeper meaning, a more applicable meaning, especially for his broader philosophical project. There are possible connections. People have explored the possible connections between Philo and the thinking of the New Testament, particularly as it relates to this form of reading Scripture for the deeper meaning. Paul in Galatians talks about Hagar and Sarah, and he even uses the word allegory. He says, I'm reading this allegorically, that Hagar is the sort of allegorically represents enslavement, and that Sarah allegorically represents the promise. And so there's all sorts of ways of thinking about this. Philo was a younger contemporary of Paul, the Apostle Paul, so same time frame, different part of the world, but still a Greek-speaking Jew who, as far as we can tell, kept kosher and was sort of, fully Jewish, to use scare quotes, even though he lived away from Jerusalem and the Holy Land. And so what I would say is, if you get the chance to read this, it's just probably a few pages from a small book like this. This is the one version of it. Is just to ask the question, what does Philo's reflection on Abraham's life add to this? Now, the treatise itself is hundreds of pages long. I've only sort of suggested that we read a few sections to see what Philo says about Abraham and Abraham's relationship with God. So again, it might add a little color to our conversation. If you don't get a chance to read it, that's totally fine. I think we'll have plenty to talk about with Genesis and Exodus. Abraham and Moses, friends of God. What does that mean? What do they tell us about the nature of friendship with God as a model for the spiritual life? I hope that we'll find out. I hope that we'll have rich and fruitful discussion. But for now, happy reading.